Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final. This is the 9th session of The Risk of Living Longer in 2024. Thank you very much for coming back. We're expecting a really big audience this afternoon, and perhaps that's a sign of the how much dementia kind of touches, I guess most families in our society, sadly. So we've got great interest and a fantastic speaker this afternoon to kind of as we head into the holiday season, to bring us a little gift of all of her kind of accumulated knowledge on preventing dementia. So I'll give a bit more background on Susan Greenfield in a moment. Just to say that the format is going to be very similar to the previous webinars. We hope that you will engage in the discussion by asking questions in the Q&A tab on your screen, please. And we'll do our best, Uli and I will do our best to try to weave them into the conversation with Susan. Perhaps I should just say a few words about Susan to introduce our esteemed guest here. Susan is a neuroscientist and really a kind of polymath, an academic, an author, a politician, and now an entrepreneur in setting up her own spin out from the work that she's been doing at Oxford University. It's been my pleasure to get to know Susan in recent weeks in trying to engage her in this conversation, and I can say that from my trying to understand the at least at a rudimentary level the science behind the work that she's been doing, it's really exciting, and I hope you find this really informative and engaging this afternoon. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a back seat from asking the questions today. And I'm going to present the first section of this afternoon's webinar just to kind of really set up and describe the importance of dementia from an actual perspective and perhaps a little bit from a societal perspective too. It's certainly something which has deeply affected my own family. My father died of Alzheimer's disease, and indeed my grandmother died of Alzheimer's disease. And 30 years ago, my father was actually working in studying dementia, Alzheimer's disease as a neuropathologist in Dundee, perhaps because he could see the decline in his own mother at that point. So I've always taken a strong interest in this, and it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to contrast the kind of modernization of the whole thing when I kind of see the work in Susan's laboratory compared to the work that my father was doing. It kind of looks really primitive in comparison. So I hope we can kind of try and convey this afternoon some of the this pace of change that's taking place and has already taken place, and the pace of change in the future, despite you'll have I imagine everybody a good awareness that there's no real effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease and dementia today. Anyway, to kind of describe the format a bit more, I'm going to pass on to Uli, who's today's lead question master.
Thank you, Douglas, and also from me, big welcome, Susan. We're really excited to have you on the webinar today. Today's agenda, Douglas already talked a bit about, he'll introduce some quantification, for the topic and how material, dementia is. And to be honest, when I saw the numbers for the first time, I was a little surprised, just how material dementia is. We'll then turn it over to Susan, who will share with us some aspects of the current science of dementia. And also, and this is I think in particular fascinating, show us a timeline for dementia that starts decades before the actual symptoms begin. The dementia detective work then dives into this longer timeline and what drives it. And what's especially noteworthy is that much of this really is real time. in the sense that this is what Susan, like, and her company really is working on, like, at the moment. Then finally, like, Susan will share with us, like, how she sees, like, dementia, like, being prevented, like, in the future, like, and really also share a timeline on that. And as Douglas already said, like, don't necessarily wait until the end, like, to put questions into the Q&A box. Like, we'll try and incorporate, like, your questions as we go along. With that, like, as we usually do, like, we'll start with a poll question, like, if we can have that. Thank you. We'll give this like in a second. Very good. Like, so Douglas, like, if you can really, like, set the context for us now. Oh, here's the results. Well, that's very interesting. Like, the reduction, like, by over 2 years. I'm sure for a lot of people, like, that's driven by the fact, like, we're having an aging population. Little surprised, like, if we can actually treat, like, dementia, like, that could actually be very positive, like, despite the fact, like, that we have an aging population. Thanks for that. So Douglas, now share with us, like, just how important dementia is.
Yeah, thanks, Uli. So back in the first one of our webinars, back in the spring, this chart was used to try to kind of, this is work that's published by Swiss Re, which shows potential sources of life expectancy improvement over time. So, so if you look along the horizontal axis, this is numbers of years into the future. And the blobs relate to different sources of mortality improvement. The bigger the blob, the more significant the improvement. And you can see Alzheimer's and dementia drugs being kind of highlighted here as the biggest blob and centered on a kind of 20-year view. So I often think when we're kind of when we're thinking about what is the aim of these webinars, it's kind of like to think about, so what will death rates look like in 20 years' time? So it's really, I'm really grateful for Susan to agree to talk to this subject. It looks like it's the biggest one in the time horizon that's kind of important to actuaries. And you can see it's much bigger than, for example, CRISPR, the gene editing technology, or indeed a vaccine for cholesterol. We see Alzheimer's drugs as being much more significant than that.
Thanks.
Sorry, Uli.
Thanks for that. It's like, so now let's look. This was forward looking, like, now let's look backward. And this is like, just like forward looking, the backward looking, like, to me is also surprising.
Yeah, indeed. And kind of one of the things, as many of you know, I crisscross across the Atlantic, sadly, too often for my own good and the planet. But one of the consequences of me spending a lot of time in the United States is that I do pick up that there's kind of more awareness of and concern about dementia in the UK than in the US. And so in preparing for this, and a great thanks to Eric Pickett for creating these charts, we wanted to look back at the actual cause of death statistics just to see the materiality of the number of dementia and Alzheimer's related deaths. So first of all, these on the left-hand side of this chart are in the UK. The green line relates to dementia and Alzheimer's. We're using the WHO categorization of deaths, so it's consistent, or it should be consistent if the doctors are all using them appropriately at the point of death when they're certifying the cause of death. Should be consistent between the UK and the US. Dementia and Alzheimer's is the most significant, if you forget about the aberration of the COVID years of the number of COVID deaths, but the most significant number of deaths today are attributable to Alzheimer's and dementia, with heart disease coming in second. And then if you do the same consistent kind of analysis in the United States, you find that heart disease is the most significant, the blue line here, but the second one is dementia and Alzheimer's. Interestingly, though, the picture is more complicated though when you look at men and women differently. Dementia is more prevalent in women than in men. And it's also kind of this comparison is somewhat confounded by the fact that the UK population is older than the US population. And you can see that, but if you look at the proportion of population over the age of 75, so that's kind of the age where you would typically be diagnosed as having dementia, it's about 30% lower, that proportion, in the United States compared to the UK. So when we look then at the differences between the UK and the US now on a gender basis, so this is women, you see in the UK, by far and away the most common cause of death for women is Alzheimer's and dementia, with heart disease the next most important. And then for men, heart disease is more significant, but the second most important is dementia and Alzheimer's. And I'm sure Susan won't mind explaining later why women are more prone to the dementia and Alzheimer's. So if you look at the same thing in the United States, you see that amongst women, dementia and Alzheimer's is already the most significant cause of death, but not that significantly different to heart disease. Then in the US, for men, heart disease by far and away the most important. And the US is kind of a different category, which is a kind of story in itself for another day. It's got a really significant number of accidents happen in the US, lots of road traffic accidents, which we don't really see in the UK as being a material number. And then Alzheimer's and dementia comes in third for men in the US. If you want to see any of these numbers in any more detail, we've actually written them up in a little note, the link to which is at the bottom here of the page. You can find it on the Club Vita website. But then to finish off my little kind of setup for Susan here, I'd like to just talk about the economic strain of dementia. Many of the early supporters of Club Vita were local authority pension funds in the UK, and local authorities in the UK are responsible for really two major public services, one being education and the other one is adult social care. So that's essentially providing care homes for care places and funding for people with dementia. And so I've always been interested in this, kind of thinking about my old local authority friends. So I looked up as I was preparing for this webinar, see what information I could find on the internet, looking at the projected future costs of dementia. There's an excellent report published by the Alzheimer's Society. These figures here I'm putting up just relate to the expected trajectory of UK dementia funding. And you can see that these are in billions of pounds, currently estimated at 42 billion pounds, with an expectation by 2040, and these are expressed in real terms, that you'd see an increase to 90 billion pounds a year. Now, to kind of give you a kind of sense of orders of magnitude, that 90 billion pounds is about half of what the government in the UK, the taxpayer, currently spends on health, that is the National Health Service, and social care combined. So it's a really, really significant cost. And if you think about the rise from 40 to 90, so that's that increase of essentially £50 million cost, and you kind of express it as an increase over and above kind of inflation over the next 15 years to get from 2024 through to 2040, it's equivalent to about 1.5% on top of inflation every year. And that would kind of give the Chancellor of the Exchequer a real, should provide for lots of sleepless nights trying to figure out how on earth to fund that. And perhaps just one final point before I shut up would be to kind of point out the magnitude of the pink bit, because it's not just the direct costs of caring for somebody with dementia, it's the indirect costs, because increasingly increasingly that tends to fall upon other family members, typically younger family members, get involved in the care of their elderly family members, and that of course means that they can't be reduces their economic contribution to society. They can't work, in other words, because they're being tied up in this looking after of older family members. And you can see that's a really, really significant part of the increase in the cost here, is the fact that you're going to effectively denude our working population by people who are now going to be caring for for other people. So the stakes here couldn't be larger in terms of trying to find a solution for dementia. Thank you, Willie. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that context. It's very helpful. So now turning the conversation, and the screen, over to Susan, and again, thank you for joining us today.
Okay.
So today we don't really have any effective dementia treatments. Maybe we can start with what does current best practice advice on preventing dementia look like?
Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Well, actually,
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, well, can I start by saying thank you so much to Douglas and the team for giving me the platform and the opportunity to share with you some of our ideas and insights into what is the biggest clinical unmet need of our time. Unlike many people, I don't have to question why I get up in the morning. I think that we can all take as read this is one of the most important issues to be tackling. So if I go to the first slide. So one is the healthy lifestyle, and people often ask, what can I do? Perhaps of these, the most obvious one there is physical exercise. Now, in the old days, it was thought that you were born with all the brain cells you'd ever have, and then it was just a matter of time as they slowly degenerated. We now know that actually you can have new brain cells, so-called neurogenesis, produced into adulthood, and this is increased with exercise. So to add to the long list of the benefits of exercise, such as keeping weight down and good for your heart, again, it can also increase production of brain cells. And we know, while we're talking about the heart, and it was interesting to see those statistics, that there is a cardiovascular element to Alzheimer's. They can be linked, and that if you have a stroke or some kind of problem with your circulation, then that can actually lead to the triggering of Alzheimer's. It goes without saying that alcohol, as shown here, increasingly people now realize, I think, that there are huge downsides to the dubious pleasures, the drinking pleasures, and smoking similarly. And again, that's bad for the heart, so that can indirectly impact on Alzheimer's. Social networks, this is really important. There's something called cognitive reserve, which is a bit like money in the bank. Cognitive, of course, from the Latin cogito, I think, meaning therefore you're learning and memory skills and talents and performance. And it's been shown that people that have a highly interactive, lively social life seem to be less prone or less sensitive to the problems of dementia. Living alone can be a real problem. avoid head injuries. This is something that people are now increasingly aware of with sports such as rugby, or where there's or boxing, of course. So there's even something called dementia pugilistica, which is dementia derived from boxing. Sadly, one thinks of Muhammad Ali as someone who had a neurodegenerative disease. My own theory for that is that if the damage that is caused by blows to the head happen to be in the primarily vulnerable cells, and we'll come on to them in a minute in Alzheimer's, then that will actually trigger, again, neurodegeneration. Something that's important to stress here, and it's probably coming through as I hope as I'm talking, that that Alzheimer's disease is not, and I repeat, it's not a natural consequence of aging. You only have to look at David Attenborough, for example, or the late Queen to know that. It is, however, a disease of older people, because the protective mechanisms that are there when you're younger are less efficient. And therefore, if you do have injuries or strokes, you can't combat them in the same way that you can with a younger brain. And again, atmospheric pollution, that's an interesting one. I know that Jacqueline here is from Canada, and there was something called the Garden of Quebec, where they were using lots of pesticides and insecticides, and they found a much higher incidence of neurodegeneration, because again, these are toxins to the brain that would kill brain cells and invite retaliation or responses. We'll come on to that later in the primarily vulnerable cells that can then lead to Alzheimer's. So when it says preventing dementia, I think that's a bit optimistic. None of us can prevent dementia. We can take measures to reduce the possibility, we hope. And so physical exercise, mixing and interacting with people, being in fresh air, and perhaps thinking twice before you take on that rugby or football game can all help, but nothing is a guarantee as yet. And what we're working on is not so much to have lifestyle changes that can be for others to worry about. What we worry about at Neurobio is actually devising a more immediate way of intercepting the problem. Now, I'm sure many people have heard of amyloid. This is named after the Greek for starch. It's a pathological abnormal deposit found in brain tissue, and it is characterizing the post-mortem Alzheimer brain. It follows, therefore, that people think that if you combat it, let's say with an antibody, that will do the job. Very sadly, that hasn't proved to be the case. It's not present in the early stages of the disease. And one of the issues with Alzheimer's is that for 10 to 20 years, the neurodegeneration is already underway, even though you have no cognitive symptoms, even though your memory is fine, you're not confused, you know where you are, you're not disorientated, you know who everyone is, you seem just fine, but silently, and this is one of the sinister aspects of the disease, for 10 to 20 years, there's this window of lost opportunity when the degeneration is underway, no one knows this, and then when finally people do present, you're closing the door after the horse has bolted. Now, at that stage, that's when people might be given these anti-amyloid agents, and any drug ending in AB is an antibody. So there's been a cluster of these out. The problem is that, first of all, it's not there in the early stages, so how can it ever be the possible target? Second, as a scientist, I have problems because if you can't explain why it's the culprit and how it evolved and why it's there, if it's just like some kind of deus ex machina, then it's hard to actually really buy into the theory completely. So there's no narrative to explain why amyloid should be the culprit. It's just there, and that's why people think you should target it. And even when you do target with this antibody, and this is perhaps the most important issue, it's not that effective. So firstly, only a few % get into the brain. Secondly, you have to have it administered intravenously very slowly for a whole day at a hospital. And that, of course, will entail, certainly in the UK, huge expense. And either side of the Atlantic, it will entail stress and a burden on the carers, as well as for someone with dementia, going through a very unusual and frightening for them experience. And that's perhaps why the National Health Service in the UK have not wanted to take it on. So although it's been passed as safe by the equivalent of our FDA, the MHRA, it's not, sadly, considered sufficiently effective to justify the cost of the National Health Service per patient per year. And I think that speaks volumes that, yes, it can decrease the amyloid burden, but on the other hand, it doesn't really affect in the longer term your memory. And people say, oh, well, it's for the early stages of the disease. And what they really mean is the early stages of the diagnosis of the disease. So it's already been present for 10 or 20 years and you come along with your antibody. So yes, it's the early time of diagnosis, but not the early time of the onset of the disease, which is why we at Neurobiome gnash our teeth when there's all this hype given and gazillions of dollars spent on something that, although it can be marginally effective for a few months in some patients, is not ideal. Not ideal as well because it can have side effects such as brain bleeds. So that is one of the issues we've been facing. Let me introduce you, therefore, to the alternative. And I'd like to stress this is still very much in development. We're a little company. We're about 6 miles outside of Oxford. As Douglas said, the original work was done when I was at Oxford University, and that was some time ago. But because I was academic, I had time to stare out the window. I was also challenged by very bright medical students in tutorials. And I had the time to join up the dots and read lots of literature. And because of that, I think there was an advantage rather than being constrained by timescales and milestones. And at that time, shareholders, I was able to have an idea. And this is the idea that I'm now going to try and explain 40 years, the results of 40 years of my life in one slide. And this might have lots of questions, and please interrupt if you want me to slow down. Okay, so let me introduce you to the primarily vulnerable cells in the brain. As you can probably see, this is the stalky bit that is continuous with the spinal cord. The cauliflower bit on the back is called the cerebellum. That isn't our focus here, but it's just to orientate you. And you can see those pinky bits. These are groups of cells that are interconnecting, and they have been identified, not by us, but by others. And they were initially identified back in the 1980s, and it's only now gaining more traction and acceptance. But nonetheless, these are the primarily vulnerable cells that are degenerating before you have cognitive problems. And they underlie sleep-wake cycles and arousal. They have nothing to do with memory. They're very primitive, very basic cells. And they come from a different part of the embryo. And for me, that was a real clue, because if something comes from a different part of the embryo during growth, then it can be very different. It has very different properties. So not all brain cells are the same. One size doesn't fit all. And these brain cells that are primarily vulnerable have different properties. And what we've done is to examine those properties and try and understand how, therefore, they can be the primary cells that are lost in Alzheimer's. So in normal stages, this is referred to as Braak stage 0. Braak is just named after a person. In fact, there's two of them, Braak and Braak. They're a married couple. And they're the pathologists who developed the stages of Alzheimer's, where you look at the degeneration in the brain. And Braak stage 0 is completely healthy, and it goes to Braak stage 6. Now, these primarily vulnerable cells are different from other cells in the brain because, as it says here, and this might sound like a good thing, they've retained the ability to grow again. So whilst other cells in the brain, when you get to maturity, lose that ability, these cells, and they come from a different part of the embryo, they're very different, they've retained the ability to grow again. But that's not necessarily a great thing in the adult, because it can be like Jekyll and Hyde. Something that stimulates growth in an embryo or a developing system in the context of the mature brain can actually turn toxic. Now, the agent that stimulates growth in these cells is something called T14. It's called T14 because it's made of 14 little building blocks called amino acids. It's a peptide, you might have heard that term, but we don't need those technical terms. Just take it read that T14 is a chemical in the brain. And it's only operational normally during development where it helps the cells to grow. So here we have a situation, we have this chemical T14, which normally helps cells grow. But because this is a mature brain, it's stable. And there's no amyloid and everything is just ticking over just fine. So far, so good. Now imagine if suddenly there is damage to these cells. Now these cells, as we've seen, it could be a stroke, it could be a head injury, it could be these molecular Rambos that are called free radicals that are there all the time, but in a mature brain, you have protective mechanisms that fight them off. Whereas when you get older, those protective mechanisms become so-called scavenging mechanisms. They're not so good. So when you're older, you're more liable to be damaged by free radicals. So let's imagine, for whatever reason, that these brain cells are damaged. Now, if they are damaged compared to other cells in the brain, They've got this mechanism at their disposal. Other cells in the brain can't grow again. These cells can, and they will do so by mobilizing T14. The problem is the T14, which in the embryo will aid growth. Now, in the context of the mature brain, in that scenario, now it's toxic. There's still no amyloid, but now the T14 is at work. And because these cells are getting damaged, you won't see any problems with memory, but you will see possibly problems with mood and sleep. Now, I'm sure everyone listening has had mood and sleep disorders in their time. So it's not a guarantee that you've got Alzheimer's, but it can be a non-exclusive prelude, something to watch out for, because, and it actually is a proof of concept that these cells are indeed the primarily vulnerable cells. They're the ones that underlie sleep and arousal, and therefore mood, because they are the chemical fountains that contain, for example, serotonin, which is the target of Prozac and similar drugs. So you can see that 20 years prior to any memory loss, things have now gone a bit wrong. You've got damage to these primarily vulnerable cells. They've tried to compensate, which other cells in the brain can't do, but in so doing, they're now starting the cycle of neurodegeneration. And what happens is this goes on. These cells have a high degree of redundancy because they're so basic and they're so primitive. Nature has enabled others to take over and to allow functions to carry on. They also contain the area for Parkinson's disease and neurodegenerative disease. And we know that you have to have 80% of the cells that have to die before you get the motor problems. So anyway, these cells are now going on dying. The more and more, so they die, so more T14 is released. So more cells die, and so even more is released. And so you have this snowball effect, this feed-forward effect that we call neurodegeneration. So you can imagine this happens slowly over the years because these cells have a high degree of redundancy. And it's only when you get to Braak stage 3 or 4, which is quite advanced pathology, that the damage will now spread. And when that happens, it will spread to these outer layers of the brain, the more sophisticated areas that relate to memory and all our cognitive functions, so-called higher functions. And it's now that someone will present with problems at the doctor. It's now that you will see amyloid present. It's now that you'll have the anti-amyloid given. And as you can see, a lot has happened prior to that, which means that it's not that effective. So we see neurodegeneration, and this is our USP at Neurobio. We say it is an inappropriate activation of development, which sounds like a paradox. And that inappropriate activation of development is driven by the T14. So the T14 in the brain is sort of a Jekyll and Hyde molecule. It's great during growth, and we've shown that it's active during growth. It's age dependent. It declines with normal aging. But if it's inappropriately triggered, as shown here, then that can lead to the neurodegenerative cycle, which then snowballs on because it's an attempt to compensate, which has the opposite effect. So more and more happens. Okay.
So there's
questions.
One question, and I think you'll cover that here in a bit. It's like, is it possible to detect when T14 has been mobilized?
Yeah,
but
that's exactly what I'm coming on to now. Yeah,
that's right. Like, you know, so in the next section, like, you know, this is the detective work section, like, you know, where I think you'll share with us like an evidence, like, you know, that's really points toward proving, like, you know, what we see on the slide here.
Yeah. So if you buy into this story, and this, I say, this has evolved over 40 years and it's been validated. And if you look at our website, you'll see we have peer-reviewed papers that support this notion. Basically, it could be quite exciting because if this is the basic mechanisms, then we can do two things. First, we can stop it, perhaps, with the drug. But as you've just suggested, perhaps we can see it read out in the 10 to 20 years before you have the cognitive impairment. Can you imagine if there was some way we could see this happening in some easily accessible body tissue or fluid before you had the memory problems? So that's called developing a biomarker, and that's what we want to do. So this is our detective work now. Okay, so we know that T14, and this is the proof, that it is there in early stages. This is the rat brain. E stands for embryo, P stands for postnatal. And you can see that in the embryo, it's very high, and then the postnatal, and it's quantified with the red histogram there. It goes up to postnatal day 60 in rats. You can see it's declining. that actually corresponds very closely to the activity of brain cells that we've measured using voltage sensitive dyes. And you can see the red blobs are the most active assemblies or large groups of cells. And you can see that our agent promoting growth corresponds to the activity of the cells as they're developing. Now, what's really interesting, this is from George Mason University on the other side of the pond, Nadine Kabani's group. We gave her some of our chemicals, and you can see here, she is showing that the T14 is actually, which has been given encased in a slightly larger molecule, but focus on the effects. You can see in the blue triangle, the blue rectangle, that there's an enhanced surface area. So this agent, our T14 encased in T30, is actually enhancing the growth of the cell. So that's proved that it's actually growing. And that is blocked by something people may have heard of called rapamycin. And I mention that because rapamycin is used for a lot of longevity studies. People think it will promote youth. So it's not just in relation to Alzheimer's, but it blocks something called the mTOR pathway. And you can see that this mTOR, which is a mechanism inside cells for helping them to grow, you can see that that has a very strong relationship with our T14. So we have shown that the T14 can actually enhance growth through this intracellular mechanism that's also sensitive to a longevity agent, rapamycin. Now, the process that T14 promotes growth isn't restricted to the brain. The brain has the same provenance as skin cells, and that sounds a bit strange and a bit left of field. But we know that, for example, people with psoriasis, that has a link to Alzheimer's, and the skin and the brain are actually quite closely related, not just in their embryological provenance, but also because they have this same mechanism with the T14. So this was work done with Unilever, and you can see here, this is 23-year-old human skin. It looks like the waves of the sea, and those brown blobs are T14 positive cells, so-called keratinocytes. And you can see, somewhat depressingly, as one advances in age, it is getting less and less because this is healthy aging. But you can see that the T14 is at work, not just in the brain, but also in the skin, and it's there as an agent for growth. Here it is in the brain, reflecting aging, in normal aging. And then we have some pilot studies from our own in-house team looking at sebum in the skin and also saliva. These are pilot studies, and I think the team get fed up with me saying, but it is quite noticeable. You can see how young everyone at Neurobio is. There's no error bars in the final group because that's just one person, and that's me. I'm the only person in the whole of Neurobio that's over 45 years of age by a garden mile. And you can see that everyone else is very young. So it's not that everyone at 45 has no variation, you can see. So this then, I hope, persuades you that T14, and we've showed this, is an agent for growth. And in normal circs, it's just what you might want. But it can turn, Jekyll can become Hyde. We say a trophic agent, which means an agent for growth, can turn toxic. And that can happen depending on how long you apply it for. You can see here, these are so-called neurite growths, the growth of extensions of cells. And at 1 hour, you can see it's had a beneficial effect on growth compared to the control. But if you keep it on for longer, then it's toxic. We've also shown that in animal model mice, which in the negative controls show nothing in their brains, no T14, that in the animal models, you can see that are modeled to replicate Alzheimer's in humans, the arrows are indicating those purpley blobs are T14 deposits that are there in the brain. And most importantly, it's age. We know that the agent for growth that is occurs by causing calcium to go into cells, that can be lethal the older cells are, and that's a published paper, which I won't show you the data of. So our theory that neurodegeneration is an inappropriate form of development is shown here. Here you can see the rat brain showing declining with age over days. And now this is the human brain, the primarily vulnerable cells, their age match. These are people aged between 70 to 90. And you can see that there is almost a doubling of the T14 in the relevant cells in the brain. So this is a little bit just showing you that we do have experiments to back up the theory. Now, what's really interesting then to the question of how can we develop some kind of marker or some way of indicating that the primarily vulnerable cells are indeed dysfunctional and there's some problem, we thought, well, let's look at mood disorders in people, plus or minus mood disorders, because as I mentioned, it can be a prelude. That stress isn't necessarily, it can be a prelude to Alzheimer's. So if that's the case, could we not use it as a kind of first pass filter to just, in a way, get people to go to the doctors? This is from the paper, if people would like to look it up. And what we have found is that these are the primarily vulnerable cells. As you can see, there's the chemical messengers, most notably in B serotonin 5-HT, which is the target of antidepressant drugs. And these are the primarily vulnerable cells. So just to orientate you, the back of the brain is on the right and the front of the brain is on the left, and you're looking at the brain sideways on. And the white hub of cells are these primarily vulnerable, very primitive brain cells. So could looking at sleep disorders, which might be for a variety of reasons, be an early way of differentiating or trying to pick up in that 10 to 20 year window that there's something going wrong? And we were very lucky to collaborate with a very prestigious hospital in Barcelona, the Clínic Barcelona Hospital, and they very kindly supplied us with samples from living patients of lumbar punctures, so-called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And what we found there is that in 10 people who had a history of mood disorders versus 12 people who didn't, but who all scored the same on cognitive tests, so all these people are cognitively normal and homogeneous and indistinguishable, we nonetheless found that there was a relationship between two markers, T14 being one of them, a very close lockstep relationship between our T14 and something called tau in people that had no history of mood disorders, but that disappeared in people with mood disorders because there was a change in the T14, which meant these two things were no longer in lockstep. So that is just some early stage way of differentiating, even though you don't have cognitive problems, some way, not of guaranteeing you have Alzheimer's, far from it, but just a way of having some kind of test that could be done ideally at home, where you could actually then see whether you had to go perhaps to the doctor or not. So that's shown here. We could have what in England is called a lateral flow test, or LFT, and I gather in the States is called an antigen test, that would be available from pharmacies. You'd use it at home like you did for COVID. It wouldn't cost very much money, but it would be a simple binary go, no go test. We could call it something like a brain health test. And I want to stress, it would not be a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It would be a test for how well those primarily vulnerable cells were working. And if they're working badly, that might be for other reasons. It doesn't matter. In fact, one would welcome it being for other reasons. So you'll do that at home. And then if it was go rather than no go, now you would go to the clinic for a much more rigorous diagnostic test. And under medical supervision, we are suggesting a saliva test that would then be sent off for quantification. And that would determine, and I'm going to show you the data, whether or not neurodegeneration is present, whether in fact there is a problem beyond just these cells having a mood swing. And if the results did indeed come back positive and you did have neurodegeneration, even though you had no symptoms, you would have all the wraparound support of the professional medical healthcare services. And in due course, as I'll show later, the ideal would be that you would then be given our drug. And if that stopped any more cells dying, then there would clearly be an advantage to taking it before you had any symptoms, because you'd never get the symptoms. So let's have a look at that test. We know that these are the stages of Alzheimer's that I've suggested, going through to Braak stage 6. And you can see our T14 in the brain is already high at Braak stage 2, but that's without symptoms, as you can see. We're thankful to the Precision for Medicine group that in the USA gave us some saliva samples. Now, these are the building blocks, and that might look a bit strange. These are the so-called amino acids. You can count them. There'll be 14 there, or there should be 14 there. That is T14. And when we look at T14, you can see in the saliva, and we're quite excited by this, there is an increase in the pink group, which is the Alzheimer group. The middle group have familial connections with people with Alzheimer's. And so the biobank, Precision Medicine, called them at risk. And that is something that one could discuss whether that was a sensible term or not. But you can see they're different from controls that are cognitively normal. That is derived from a parent molecule that I mentioned earlier called T30, and it's normally cleaved from T30. So if we were measuring T30, and if T14 has gone up, one would expect T30 should go down. And that's exactly what we find. And we find that with a much more rigorous statistics, because the system we were using for measuring the T30, which is not available for smaller molecules like T14, was more sensitive. So this T30 test is the one that looks for us the most exciting. But you could then say, and I'm sure all the actors here will notice, that the middle group, the at-risk group, that there's a huge variation, and the significance derives from the fact the Alzheimer group is so clustered. So why is there this variation selectively in that middle group? Because the other two groups don't have it. So it's not to do with our test. It turns out that the controls at risk have a very high correlation with body weight. So the more obese you are and the lower your T30, then so the heavier you are, it seems to relate to the lower the T30, only in that control at risk group. Now we know obesity is a risk factor in Alzheimer's, and one possibility is that within those primarily vulnerable cells, we have an area called the hypothalamus, which actually regulates appetite and so on. Obviously, there's not time to go into this now, but what is intriguing us is that one could now devise, and our friendly statistician is doing so, some kind of metric that incorporates both weighing someone and looking at their saliva for T30, and then coming up, hopefully, with a very accurate prediction. So that's our work in just a quick overview. As I say, it's 40 years of my life that is shown in 3 slides. We can stop the Alzheimer's with a drug, we can stop the T14, and we hope this will be an anti-Alzheimer drug, with something called MBP14, neurobiopeptide 14, which is, for our own, revolutionary but novel but very simple. It's simply the evil T14 but bent into a circle, so-called cyclated. So it's no longer functioning. It's still there, but it's inert. And that occupies the active site of the normally evil T14, knocks it off its chair. It's a bit like someone with their hands tied behind their back being knocked off their chair, so that it can't, the normal T14 can't work, and the MBP doesn't do anything because it's been rendered inert by cyclating it. And what's very exciting is if you compare it with the anti-amyloid, I think there's a lot of obvious advantages to it. So the future for dementia treatment, MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment, MMSE stands for mini mental status exam, which is the current way of evaluating someone's cognitive performance. And as you can see, there's this horrible time window with the dotted line, but our vision is that you would first have a home-based test, and you have to have a home-based test because you couldn't tax all medical services by the healthy, normal people all going to the doctors for tests. You could do this at home. That would filter out, it'd be a go, no-go test. And if it was go, you'd then have the saliva test, which would be much more accurate with all the support of the healthcare services. And if our vision is realized, the doctor would say, I'm afraid there's bad news. You have this neurodegenerative condition. You haven't got any cognitive symptoms now. But the good news is if you take this drug developed by Neurobio, which is a nasal application taken several times a week, that stops any more cells dying. That's what happens in rats, in mice. So let's hope it happens the same in humans, and it is a big if. But if it happens in humans the same as it does in mice, it will stop any more cells dying, so that if you take it before you have any symptoms, then you'll never get the symptoms. So that would be an effective treatment, and a very low cost one, and one that's nice for the patients, no great hospitalization, no exotic or ethically questionable implants or anything like this, but very straightforward home-based test, a doctor test, and then a nasal delivered drug. So that is, I know we're running out of time, so I'll just show you how our MBP works. In animal models, they put on weight better. When they're exploring, animals that are animal models can't recognize novel objects. They explore them both equally for the same amount of time. So normal animals will explore something that's novel, as shown here in the red, much more extensively, whereas the Alzheimer model mice can't distinguish between familiar and novel, whereas our mice, although they are animal model mice, they can distinguish it. Moreover, when given our drug, you can see the gold blobs amyloid. There's way less amyloid in the brain.
Susan, before you skip on, maybe just for the actuaries who have not come across this before, just explain what you mean by the Alzheimer's disease model mouse. What is that?
Okay, yeah. So as you might imagine, you have to be able to experiment on animals, most typically rats and mice, before obviously you can start trying to get drugs to give to humans. And the problem for Alzheimer's is you need a model. You need to be able to replicate authentically the profile of Alzheimer's in a rodent. Now, the tests don't prove a problem because you can devise a memory test. It's not very sophisticated, such as novel object recognition. The problem lies in replicating the underlying mechanism. particularly as in the case here, people don't know what the mechanism is. Nonetheless, the sort of gold standard that has been used until we've come along, we hope to have our own one, but the typical animal model is the so-called 5-FAD, as you can see there, animal model. 5-FAD stands for 5 times familial Alzheimer model, and that is a genetically tweaked animal, a so-called transgenic animal, that will overexpress amyloid. So that has, and such animals, as you can see, are rather poor on memory tests. So that has been accepted by the community, that they are used, these animal models are used. They're not ideal, they don't replicate the full clinical profile. They are, after all, rodents, so you can't have sophisticated tests on them, but you have to work with what you have and what's available. And this was why the organization that did this work for us, a company called Evitech, that's why they suggested using this model, and it was good for the job. You can see it showing it. Yeah.
Very helpful. Thank you. Uli, questions? We've got a little bit less time than we hoped, but we've still.
Yeah, I'm sorry I went over.
But, no. Yeah. I think this is really. I found that really powerful testimony, Susan. Thank you so much.
Should I keep the slides up or should I put the slides off? Should I take the slides off or not?
Yeah, like you can take them off.
Okay.
And Douglas, like, you know, I think this is a topic that you should be including in your reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah, I'd like to do the poll again and see now if people think that it's going to extend life. I'd like to think it extend life by way more than 2 years. I'd like to think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just taking a few questions like from the audience. First one, your research highlights T14 as a potential upstream driver of Alzheimer's. Given its role, like in development and toxicity in the mature brain, like, do you see any challenges in targeting T14 to prevent unintended effects on other cellular processes?
Okay, well, that's a super question. The nice thing about T14 is that it works not directly at the primary site of a so-called receptor, but on a side site. So its effects most typically, when it's at work, are to increase calcium entry, not to turn it on or off, which means that if it's not working or it's not blocked, the cells are functioning just fine. If it's activated, then we do know it's absolutely, and this is quite unusual in pharmacology, selective for that one site. And we published this year, and we were amazed that we were allowed to get away with that in the title, and that the referees were convinced, because it's quite unusual in pharmacology to have an agent that only works on one so-called receptor. But this does, which means that it's only active when it's needed, when in development, and otherwise it will be dormant. So if you block it, the drug itself does nothing. The MBP14 is inert. So we hope, and so far in our test, although it's still got lots to do, that there'll be minimal side effects.
Thank you. Question maybe that hits a little closer to home, like how long would it take for this to be tested, approved, and if successful, released to the public?
Okay, well, there's 2 areas. It's the biomarker and it's the therapy. So they have different time courses, because no one dies giving a nasal swab, as you might imagine. Yeah, so it's easier to develop and have the biomarker up and running, and there's 2. We've been talking to the lateral flow company, or the antigen company, whatever they're called, and they could develop the kit, they could develop the actual device in a few months. So with a fair wind and with appropriate funding, that's always the case, we could say by Easter have something to hold in our hands. The whole thing then is to develop it and validate it and test it and so on, which will take about another year or so. We are talking to various clinics where we could test for the mood disorders or not. So the psychiatrists are also interested in this, because there's no readout of mood disorder at the moment. You have to have subjective interviews and assessments from psychiatrists, which take a long time. So we are already talking, and we're already doing ethics applications for this antigen test, lateral flow test, to be validated for plus or minus mood disorders. As regards the second test, this is with something that's fancier than antibodies and newer, but better, called aptamers. We are talking with the companies, and we're hoping that we can develop that within a year, and then it would have to be launched and marketed and tested and so on. But within 2 years, I would like to think that we'd have a very realistic prospect of it being available. The drug, of course, takes longer, and it has to go through strict regulatory stages, so-called IND, that stands for Investigational New Drug. And with our current stage, the MBP14 already has had some of those things, some of those boxes ticked, but there's still a lot to do. Again, depends on funding and so on, but that would take about a year to two to go through the regulatory stages, to develop the so-called formulation, that's to say to have it in a preparation that is administered in humans through the nose, and has to be tested in 2 species, one of which can't be a rodent, and so on. If you then qualify, you go to phase 1, and I'd like to think we could be in phase 1 again in, let's say, 2 years. But that doesn't mean to say it's being tested for efficacy. It's tested then for merely showing that people don't break out in hives and so on. It's given to healthy people in escalating small doses to check you don't have side effects. But once you're at that stage, then I think things move very quickly, and certainly pharmaceutical companies get very interested very quickly. So I'd like to think within 2 years, we could, if we were having this conversation in 2 years, I'd like to think that we were already in the clinic or contemplating the clinic.
Right, thanks. And I think you mentioned, like, you know, if there's an indication to take the medication, like, you know, you would take it for the rest of your life effectively.
You would, but you would never, if our dream, and I do stress this as a dream, if our dream is realized, it means that you would never then have the cognitive impairment. You'd be taking a drug like many people do. And the other application, of course, is the biomarker can be used much earlier on for monitoring things and testing and for looking at efficacy of other drugs as well. Yeah.
Right. Fairly different question. Douglas?
Yeah, maybe just to chip in and reinforce this, because this is a big, you know, an important point for me. I think even though it may seem that the NBT14 drug is some way away still, you're quite optimistic, Susan, that actually the anti-amyloid stuff that we criticized at the beginning here actually might have value in the short term if you could actually identify the people who much earlier in the process.
Well, that's just an idea, but it seems a reasonable one, that the earlier you can intercept something, the more effective you'll be. Yeah, so obviously it would have to be tested, and it can't be yet because as yet no one has started to give drugs in that time window before they have the problems. But that is something that certainly could be tried. Yes. Yeah.
Fairly different question. Are minor memory issues, like, or relatively minor memory issues at a young age, any indication of predisposition for Alzheimer's?
Oh, that's a hard one, because I think as we become more aware of Alzheimer's, and as you know, perhaps we're too strict with ourselves on thinking that we should have memories like computers or something like this. Depends what you mean by a minor memory issue. The early indication is usually long-term memories are the most robust. Is short-term memory. If people start, you know, the classic thing is going into a room and then forgetting why you went in there and having to go in again, or certainly repeating yourself. But also, it's the more immediate memories. Like there's a case of someone going to London and then not knowing why they were there, and so on. But my own view is, rather than worry about whether you have it, is just to focus on having a life where you have lots of physical exercise, you're interacting a lot with people, you have a healthy diet, because that makes for a good life anyway, and an interesting life anyway.
Thank you. Last question. Any thoughts you have, like, on NAD plus boosting and using drugs like metformin or GLP-1 based to limit insulin spikes to prevent dementia?
I'm not familiar. I can't speak at length about that. What I would suggest is that those sorts of drugs treat all brain cells, all cells as the same. And, you know, our great difference is that we can see the differences, that one size doesn't fit all. So, you know, one should let 1,000 flowers bloom, obviously. But on the other hand, I think that one should be looking for something that doesn't just have a downstream, more generic effect on brain cells.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And finally, like, you know, our poll, like, you know, at the end, like, you know, if you could let us know.
Oh,
like, you know,
yeah, I don't want to see this. Embarrassing to see.
We'll take away the numbers,
Please
Susan,
take it,
and analyze them,
yeah.
put them in a lockbox. But thank you so much for taking part in this. I'm sorry it was a bit rushed at the end. We had a few questions that we didn't manage to
Well,
address.
people can email me if they want.
We will
Share
send
my
them all
email.
on to you, and
Of course, with pleasure.
we'll share them on an unattributed basis, the responses to those questions, if you're
my pleasure.
able to respond to them. That would be great. And so I think it just remains for me to thank everybody for putting on today's webinar, and to wish everybody a happy holiday. It's not it's already lots of Christmas decorations up in London here. So anyway, have a great time. We hope to be back in the new year with some more reasons to be cheerful. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for the chance to share our data. And happy Christmas, happy holidays, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.